Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us once again on the Neon Salon. I'm here with Wayne Turmel, the author of several nonfiction and fiction titles, the latest of which being Johnny Lycan and the Anubis Disc, an urban fantasy book that I have to say I enjoy very much. So we will talk about that and all of the other titles as well, and also why he chose Las Vegas as his home and creative center. Wayne, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for the invitation. This is fun. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. So we're just going to dive right in, kind of basic intro question-y type stuff first. So how did you get started with writing?
You know, I've written most of my life just in different forms. Soon as I got out of high school, I spent the next 18 or 19 years as a stand-up comic and was writing jokes and traveling around North America and doing all that good stuff. And then when I moved to LA and decided to become a screenwriter, and that, you know, got a couple of things optioned, but never got anything made, and quit show business and joined the real world, but kept writing originally articles and then contributing chapters to books and eventually writing business-oriented communication books. 6 years ago, my first novel came out, which was The Count of the Sahara. And so I've just been alternating back and forth and writing and putting stuff out ever since. So I've really written my entire life. I got serious about fiction 7 or so years ago.
And that kind of answers the other question, which was, did you always want to write, or did you come to it from
Always.
somewhere else?
I thought writing was so cool. I believed all those stupid TV shows that showed you how glamorous the writing life was. You know, and these people lived in great country homes with fabulous libraries, and, you know, I have to go to Philadelphia for a reading tomorrow, and adventures would ensue. And they lied to us, Sarah. They lied.
They absolutely did lie. I have yet to see a single country estate anywhere. Speaking of which, I mean, there aren't a whole lot of country estates out here in Las Vegas. So kind of hard to come by anyway. What brought you here?
I grew up in Canada and got highly allergic to winter.
Oh, yeah.
Well, what happened actually is when I left Canada and moved to LA to become a big star, and we see how that worked, I met my bride, and then we wound up spending 18 years in Chicago. And a few years ago, she looked at me and said, if you want to keep living with me, it will be somewhere warmer than Chicago. And we knew it was going to be south and west because she has family in California and I can't do the South. I'm just too Canadian. And so we started kind of narrowing it down. And Vegas, I had visited Vegas a number of times off the Strip. She'd been coming since the 70s, but always, you know, as a tourist. And I said, there's a city here. We might kind of dig this. And so we picked a couple of locations around the Southwest and spent a week living local as best we could. And by about the Wednesday that we were here in Vegas, she's like, yeah, I could do this.
So what year did you end up relocating here?
We got here October of 2018.
Okay, so pretty recently then.
Well, relatively. I mean, another 6 months will qualify as locals. But it's almost exactly 2.5 years, amazingly enough. When you do the math, it gets a little surprising.
Yeah. Is it 2.5?
Yeah.
2018 was
2018, 20. We're halfway into 2021.
I know. Yeah, I can't
carry the 3.
I always forget to carry the 3. 2020 kind of ruins my math abilities.
It did that, yes.
Yeah, I think it's done that to a lot of people. So tell us a story or two, maybe, about what, like, maybe the first, few days or week or something.
You know, when you live in a city like Las Vegas, we have a couple of friends who moved here about the same time we did, and they've already left with their tail between their legs. It's just, Vegas is too much for some people. We love it. And I think it's because both Joan and I left our families very young and moved somewhere, just loaded up the truck and moved. And so adventure and being a black sheep kind of fits. But about oh gosh, 3 months ago, we had a week where we just looked at each other and said, this is why we live in this town. Because there are things that happen here that you either find highly amusing or you just decide that this place is too weird. Within like 3 days of each other, she had taken the dog to the groomers and she come home and she goes, well, there was a camel at PetSmart. She's standing in line to pay the dog groomer, and sure enough, there is a camel standing at the front door of the PetSmart. And she says to the young girl behind the counter, there is a camel at the front door of PetSmart. And the girl never looks up. Yes, they're teaching it to socialize. As if, what other explanation could you need? And that does not happen in Cleveland, right?
No.
So we think this is hysterical. This is the story of the week. 3 days later, we're driving down Silverado Ranch, and there is a man on the sidewalk walking up the street, and there's something bright and colorful on his arm. And we're trying to figure out what it is. And he's got one of these huge Terry Fader style ventriloquist puppets. And he's walking up the street, 2:00 in the afternoon, engaged in conversation with this puppet. And we're driving and we're kind of going, okay, is he rehearsing? Is he having an incident? We don't know what his story is, but it's highly amusing because the puppet is as engaged as he is. And we get to this corner, and I swear to you, the puppet does this. The puppet looks both ways to make sure that it's safe to cross. You know, that's just another day in Vegas. And I love that. It's the writer in me. I can't get enough weird human behavior.
The weirdest stuff in Vegas doesn't even happen on the Strip. It like happens in the streets of where people live, but it's kind of like runoff from the Strip. So it's you're living in this weird,
Well, I firmly believe that there are places in the world that, and they should be, right? First of all, I'm a big believer in legalized red light districts. I think every place needs some place where you can go do whatever it is you're going to do that you don't want anybody to know about and go home and be normal, right? Mm-hmm. I'm a big believer in that. But on top of that, there are places where all the black sheep, people who don't quite fit in, congregate. LA in the 50s was like that. In the 50s and 60s, all the freaks and weirdos kind of met moving west and then stopped because any further west they'd have to learn Japanese, right? So they kind of congregated in LA, and Vegas is one of those places. And I am way more attracted to black sheep and weirdos than I am normal humans.
I agree, totally. And that's what makes, I think Vegas in general and the writing community here specifically, which we'll kind of get into a little bit later, so great. Like, it's just, you've got black sheep within a group of black sheep kind of, and it's so welcoming.
It's also, fortunately, because California and New York and all of these places have gotten so ludicrously expensive, all the artists are looking for somewhere else to go, right? And Vegas has an incredibly diverse art scene for a city of this size. And it's only getting cooler all the time. When I moved here, I was shocked at the size and kind of diversity in pretty much every sense of the word of the writing community here.
I was the same way. Like, I got pulled in by the Henderson Writers Group, the Las Vegas Writers Conference. And then I came here and found all of the other, writers of Southern Nevada and Sin City, but also like the niche groups, like the horror chapter, horror writers chapter, and the children's books and the erotica, and like so much.
And sadly, sometimes they're the same chapters, so you have to be very careful, but welcome to Vegas.
Yeah, exactly. Let's talk a little bit about your books.
Okay.
I guess, we're here, we might as well, right? The first book that you had available was in 2003, A Philistine's Journey, Journal. Oh, I got that wrong. Sorry. A Philistine's Journal.
It was basically my midlife crisis. It was a few years after I'd moved to Chicago and I was 40-ish, and, you know, was trying to figure out what to do with my brain when I wasn't working. And I was collecting these series of books that I had when I was a kid called the Classics Club, which was all of these great works of literature, right? They were very attractively bound because in the 60s, people believed the books were purely decorative, and you would have these huge collections. And I started working my way through them. And writing, you know, and the stand-up in me couldn't resist writing little jokes and what I thought about them. And so A Philistine's Journal, An Average Guy Tackles the Classics, which I don't even think you can get anymore, except I've got about 15 copies in the house, was basically a book of essays. And what I did was I wrote these essays, and then because all of these books were in public domain, I would choose a few pages of the book so that you could read what I was talking about, and you could say, well, yes, I have read some John Locke, because you have. It was in the book. And it was a fun little exercise and got me started thinking of myself as a writer beyond just the articles and things that I was writing for work, and frankly kept me sane. There aren't a lot of people who leave stand-up or show business, acting, whatever, and, you know, manage to find something that they love to do and that stokes that creative thing that, you know, stops the squirrels in your head from running rampant. And I'm very lucky in that I found that. So yeah, that was my first book. And that one, a little publisher in suburban Chicago put it out, and that was the beginning.
What sort of books did you read for that one? You mentioned
it
Locke.
was everything. And, you know, some of them were wonderful. This sounds really, after all the goofy conversation we've had, this sounds really pretentious and arty, but, you know, the essays of Michel de Montaigne. He was a lawyer. He wasn't a priest. He wasn't a king, whatever, who basically said, I got stuff to say. And there were wonderful things in there, little truisms about what it is to be an artist and to be inventive. And
after that, your nonfiction career kind of moved towards this Remote Leadership Institute.
I had to join the real world and run away from the circus and get a job. I had this 18-year hole in my resume, right? I've got no college degree, and I was a stand-up, and what do you do? So, you know, if you look for the Venn diagram of jobs, no resume, stand there and talk. It's a very thin slice. And I found myself in corporate training. And I did some stuff, sold cars and all kinds of stuff. But I knew that this was something I might be good at. And when I got into training, of course, the first thing was presentation skills. You know, teach what you know, right? And so I became fascinated with how people communicate at work or don't. And I just kind of kept getting promoted in this company. The company kept getting bought and sold, and I was kind of the last man standing. But I got fascinated by communication. And then a few years ago, I remember somebody said to me in a class, they said, Wayne, you know, this standing in front of the room stuff is great, but, you know, I only talk to people like 3 times a year. The rest of the time I'm on this new thing called WebEx. Something in my brain said this was going to be a thing. Nobody was teaching people how to be good presenters in this new technology. And so that's what I did. And I did that through an employer. And then when they eventually took me out back and shot me, I started my own consultancy, and I wrote, you know, riveting bestsellers such as 6 Weeks to a Great Webinar and Meet Like You Mean It, A Leader's Guide to Painful and Productive Virtual Meetings. And then 6 years ago, actually just about the time that Count of the Sahara came out, a guy that I'd known for years through my podcasting and writing, Kevin Eikenberry, he bought my company. And we formed this thing called the Remote Leadership Institute. And I've continued to write in that field. Kevin and I have 2 books out, Long Distance Leader, Rules for Remarkable Remote Leadership, and the long distance teammates, stay engaged and connected, working anywhere. All of this was either out or planned before COVID hit. And so we have very much been in the right place at the right time, which is killing my writing the sequel to Johnny because the day job is kind of blown up. But I'm very lucky to be in the right place at the right time.
That's a kind of a good problem to have. I mean, it's too bad about the fiction, but I mean, still pretty lucky there.
Well,
so,
I'm still 4 novels in 7 years. I can't squawk too much.
You had planned to write The Long Distance Teammate before COVID started. That was always
It's funny.
on the
We
table.
had to hand in the first draft of the book on January 21st
of 2020.
of 2020. By the time we got the revisions back and had to do the final draft, COVID had hit and there were entire chapters that had to be rewritten. I mean, It's funny how fast things happened. When I did Meet Like You Mean It, Zoom literally did not exist. When we did the first draft of Long Distance Teammate, Zoom existed, but it was a mostly free product. No corporations were using it. It was kind of a minor player. And, 6 months later, it was a verb. And a year later, it was a syndrome. Like we were already talking about Zoom fatigue. And so it's been a scramble to keep up on the whole thing, but it's been great. And I'm incredibly lucky. So.
Yeah. So you must be doing pretty well with the sales then, or engagement.
By book standards, this is really inside baseball, but it's mostly writers who are watching this, right?
Yeah, I'm sure.
So we have a real publisher, Barrett Kohler, very respected business publisher. The average business book sells fewer than 5,000 copies in a year.
Okay.
Long Distance Teammate came out in January of 21, and we've already hit that number and then some.
Wow, congratulations.
So we're not going to get rich off of it, but it sells, and by business book standards, it's selling very nicely. So
that's great. Yeah, good for you guys. And has that helped the Long Distance, the previous book, The Long Distance
actually,
Leader too?
the other one, Long Distance Leader, is selling as well or better than Teammate right now. It has not fallen off in 2 years, which is wonderful because I use those to, support my fiction habits. So I can promote my books and do the stuff that I want to do. So it works quite nicely, actually.
Yeah, no kidding. Is there a plan for a third book in the series now, or are you guys?
Oh, I'm sure there is. I mean, what I should do is rewrite and repurpose Meet Like You Mean It and do a second edition.
Mm-hmm.
I self-published that one. I've been trying to avoid cutting a check, so and it needs some serious updating because the world has changed in the last 5 years. Absolutely,
even just the last year, it's like
So like probably there will be something. It won't be this year, but probably by this time next year, there will be another business book of some description out there.
Yeah, kind of in the same like long distance brand name sort of thing.
Yeah.
So you said you have a publisher for that. So do you handle any of like the advertising for it yourself, the marketing, or do they do?
Again, major inside baseball. Kevin, who has the checkbook and it's his company because his name's on the door, has invested a buttload of money. Just as an example, he spent $12,000 the year that Leader came out to get us into airport bookstores. You have to pay, and the more you pay, the better position you have in the airport bookstore. So we are technically a Hudson bestseller. Did not turn a profit on that little. It's not like we sold 12 grand worth of books in airport bookstores. But what that does for a nonfiction book, and if you're a nonfiction author, please listen to this. The book is not going to make you rich. What it does is it is a very expensive calling card that if you do it right, I mean, the division of the company that I work for tripled our revenue last year. And almost all the big business that came from people who read the book.
So they bought the book, read it, and then came to buy some other.
And then said, these guys must know what they're talking about. And if they have a choice between giving it to some consultant they've never heard of and the guy that wrote the book, they're going to go to the guy that wrote the book.
Of course.
And so as a, whatever your business is, this is a horribly sexist Chicago term, but you want to be the guy. I got a webinar guy, I got a this, I got a that. And a book, even a self-published, I mean, even something like Meet Like You Mean It, which is a very slim self-published book, has paid my rent, not in terms of book sales, but in terms of I'm the guy, right? If you go and you Google web meetings, there I am. And that, as somebody who works in consultancy or somebody who has a nonfiction book of some sort, is the mother lode. That's what you hope to accomplish. Now, to market it is incredibly expensive and time consuming.
Which honestly is refreshing to hear, because I see so many ads and I've taken so many free classes about market for free and make a bunch of, get a bunch of hits and get a bunch of reviews or whatever. And they never work. It just feels like the system still is, you got to spend money to make money. And that's sort of the way it works.
Always have had.
Yeah, no, that's what I'm saying. It's not new.
I mean, Hemingway had this big publisher behind it. And by the way, he still had to write articles and do all this other stuff. And, there is a reason that most famous authors prior to probably the Victorian age were rich. Or more to the point, they were the poor kids of rich parents. There's and it's like that in all the arts. Yeah. Right? If you're a painter, you've got to be able to get out there, and you've got to be able to pay for the booth, and you got to be able to go to the art shows, and you got to be able to do all that stuff, and that ain't cheap.
No, absolutely. And I think there is an expectation right now, especially in fiction writing, self-published fiction writing, where it's like, if you're not making the top 10 Amazon and you're spending, more than X amount of money every month, you're failing. It's like, you have to be able to do it for nothing, and you should be, getting all this attention. And it can be very discouraging when that doesn't happen. But the truth is, it almost never happens.
I'm going to a conference in November for the 20 books to 50K group. I don't know if you know them. It's a conference that's going to be here in Bally's. LMBP Publishing here in Vegas that sponsors the event, and Mike Anderley and lovely people. And they crank out, and I mean crank out, kind of the ebook equivalent of the old dime store novels.
Right.
Almost all genre, urban fantasy, horror, whatever.
Yep.
And their theory, if you do this and you invest this and you've got enough books, and that's the problem, it's a very long tail process, right? So your first number of books, you don't make very much money, and it's very frustrating. But by the time you get to book 10, 11, the way that people consume ebooks is, you finish that book, it says, hey, do you like that? Here's another one by this guy. Yeah. And the theory, and it works for a lot of people, is that it becomes a self-perpetuating ecosystem. But you have to cut the checks to Amazon, and you have to run the campaigns, and you have to do all of that stuff. And you're not going to get rich, but it's income, and you can kind of keep it generating. Now,
right.
I'm going to be 60 years old in a couple of months, and I've got 14 books under my belt. I can't imagine doing 20 in the next 5 years, which is the pace at which these people crank this stuff out.
Right.
So, is it possible? Sure. But it's a lottery, always has been.
And I have seen that self-published authors, or, even small press authors, or even, traditional authors, They do seem to do better when they have both. They've got a nonfiction thing that they can kind of use the way you are with a service that they offer in addition to the book. And then they kind of use that.
Well, you got to pay the bills.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's anybody who goes into writing solely for the money has been misinformed.
Unfortunately.
On the other hand, I mean, it is literally my only social interaction.
Same.
I work from home. I never leave the house. And until a year ago, we were going to Sin City writers meetings and we were sitting in coffee shops and arguing about stuff. I tell people all the time when they say that writing is a lonely business, I go, then you're doing it wrong. Mm-hmm. Because typing is lonely. Writing is social.
Yeah. Speaking of fiction, you started writing fiction in 2015, is that right?
Yeah, give or take.
With the Count of the Sahara.
I got news.
What?
I got news about that book, talking about how once you write something, it's out in the world. Mm-hmm. So the first novel that I did is called Count of the Sahara. It was done by a small, mostly ebook press in the UK. And it was about a real life character that I was totally obsessed with, this guy named Byron de Prorock, who for about a year was the most celebrated archaeologist in the world, and then his life turned to complete ruin. And I was fascinated by this character. So I wrote this book, which is based on a real tour that he did in the 1920s. And it was a really ambitious book. It takes place partly in Algeria in 1925 and then partly in the Midwest in the 20s. And I say all this only to say that I got an email 2 days ago out of the blue from a woman who said, I am Byron de Prorock's granddaughter. And I want to thank you for writing this book.
Oh.
How cool is that?
That is awesome.
It was pretty great.
Talk about winning the lottery. Like, she found your book out of all of those books.
Well, I mean, if you do a Google search on Byron de Prorock, you're going to find my book. It's not like he's, it's not going to be 20 Google pages in, right?
Right.
But how cool is that? And she goes, oh, and I've got twin nephews and they're going to read it. And that rocks. And that was 2015. Then I wrote Acras Bastard, which again is historical fiction, but it's about a 10-year-old boy in the Crusades who gets caught up in the Battle of Hattin, which was a real event. And I kind of think of it as Kipling's Kim, set in the Crusades. It's the same idea. He kind of gets co-opted into being a spy and whatever. And that one I self-published.
Okay.
Along with the sequel, Acras Orphans, which came out 2 years later. So those two books kind of sit together. And then I got this crazy idea that said, Wayne, you've sold a few books. Let's just completely blow it up and do an entirely different genre where all the, 3-4 years of being in the Historical Novel Society and blogging with other historical novelists and kind of developing a network there. No, let's blow it up and do this urban fantasy thing. And talk about Venn diagrams. If you take the Venn diagram of people who care about orphans in the Crusades and European archaeologists and how to do a good Zoom meeting and werewolf detectives, that is a very, very thin.
Your ideal client profile is very small.
Exactly. But here I are.
I think that kind of trajectory, it seems to happen more often than we think.
Most writers, a lot of writers, are what I call bibliographically promiscuous.
I think that's a great phrase.
We're basically book sluts and we'll read anything.
Yeah.
And, because when I was writing historical fiction, they'd say, what do you read? And I go, well, right now I'm reading this, I'm reading the Dresden Files, or I'm reading this, or I'm reading that. And they're like, really? He's like, yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have you know, all of
Right.
the official works of Patrick Cronwell up on the shelf. But sometimes you got to eat jelly beans, you know.
Hmm. Yeah, I love the Dresden Files. They're like a palate cleanser whenever I've just gotten off. I think I read the corrections and then I was like, I need White Knight or whatever it was that was coming next
Yeah,
in the queue.
exactly right. Some days you want. One of my favorite writers is Mark Halperin, who did A Winter's Tale and Soldier of the Great War,
Yep.
and his stuff is so good. It literally makes me want to quit writing. I mean, he has the most brilliant prose, and his books are like this thick, and you know you're taking a month off to get through this sucker, and it's worth it. And sometimes you just want jelly beans.
Yep. You can't do what's good for you all the time.
You can't.
It's so boring. Yeah.
And you know, this story had been kicking around in my head for a while, and I have this vision of kind of what the series can be and kind of what the character can be. And I was like, you know, it's not like I have a big old contract to deliver the next whatever book sitting there.
Right.
You know, some of my readers for Acras Orphans are mad at me because I've left poor Luca stuck in the city of Tyre. But ain't nobody paying me to write the next book.
Do you have another book in mind for that series, or is that kind of like not really on the table?
I kind of know where it needs to go. See, it was never intended to be a series.
Oh, okay.
I wrote Acras Bastard, and at the end, I wrote this lovely epilogue where the character is an old man looking back on his life. And my daughter told me, if you leave that in there, I will put you in a home and never visit. So I said, oh, okay, I got to write another Luca book.
So that is how you went from historical fiction to urban fantasy, is you just decided, no, I'm going to do this next.
It was a couple of things. And one part of it was being part of Sin City Writers. Okay. And I'll tell you why. This is, you know, I should have way better artistic vision than in fact I have. I wanted to write this story. I thought it would be a really cool story. But one of the things is, unlike my previous writers group in Chicago, at Sin City, you bring it in and you read it out loud and people give it, and you can only have sections that are so big. Like you can't bring in more than 1,500 words. Mm-hmm. And as it turns out, with a book like this, that's just about a chapter. And so in order to keep it short and write 1,500 words so that I would be able to, it changed the style of the book and made it this very short, cliffhanger-y kind of thing, which fits the style of book very nicely, but is very different than the historical novels I'd written, where the average chapters, you know, 3,500 or 4,000 words. People that read historical fiction want the details. They want to know what the castle looked like. They wanted to know what kind of armor the knight had on. They want to know what Luca was eating that night. Mm-hmm. That's, you know, those are that's why people read historical fiction. And you give the audience what they want. That's what I want in historical fiction. I mean, the research that I did for Count of the Sahara, I've still got boxes of stuff that now I'll send to his granddaughter because it's not like I'm using it. So yeah, it's like the social situation that I found myself in, living in Vegas, all that stuff changed kind of how my brain approached the writing.
We've talked a little bit about the transition between historical fiction. We haven't really talked about what Johnny Lycan and the Anubis Disc is about.
It is a detective story, kind of a blue-collar detective story, very Spencer for Hire. Some of the reviews try to sound very, if Raymond Chandler wrote werewolves, well, you know, I ain't writing Raymond Chandler. But Johnny's a very blue-collar guy. Spencer for Hire is probably the most direct thing to point at, with the exception that Johnny is a werewolf. He is, in fact, a Lycan. You know, he's about to turn 30. He's been kind of a ne'er-do-well his whole life, and he's trying to get it together. And, you know, he's figured out, with the help of his best friend, that he can actually make a business being a detective, finding stolen items, retrieving them, that kind of thing, using the only skill he has, which is his lichen powers. And so it's probably too funny. The horror reviewers get all grumpy because they don't think it's horror-y enough. But, you know, it makes me laugh and it amuses me. And, you know, the idea of being a werewolf and trying to turn a doorknob, you know, that's got to be frustrating. I don't care who you are. So that's the idea. And there's a couple of things about it I really like. You pointed out, rightly so, that because it's set in Chicago and all that, it smells very Dresden-y. And it does. I mean, you know, you can play Spot the Influence. That's certainly one of them. I like the way that Chicago is portrayed in the book. I think I've done a really nice job of capturing that, he says immodestly. I was originally going to call the book Johnny Lichen. And then I realized when I was a kid, I read all these horrible pulp novels that my dad always had. And there was a series called The Executioner. Mac Bolan, The Executioner. Did you ever read any of them? They were horrible. And they had titles like Philadelphia Fury, Miami Massacre. This guy had declared a one-man war on the mafia, but each book was a different city and a different adventure. But, you know, there were some of the same characters throughout the book. And, you know, when I was a kid and I'd read, you know, Tom Swift and his atomic submarine, I just loved that notion of a whole series of books where you knew what the main character was, and then each book kind of stood alone on its own. So you could pick up the series anywhere and go, oh, but there's more. Cool. The work in progress, Johnny is in Vegas.
Which
on
I'm very
assignment,
excited.
which gives me a chance to be snarky about Vegas, which is so much fun. You know, I get to do for Vegas what I did for Chicago. And you know, because Johnny is a dyed-in-the-wool Chicagoan, and you know what people are like from the Midwest when they come to Las Vegas, you know, you either find the guy with the puppet funny or you don't.
I can't wait to see which one Johnny is for everyone watching. I read the book. I covered it in a new book club. It's no secret that I really, really liked it. But I think, and I did say it was very much like Dresden Files. But I think it's got many things going for it other than just being like Dresden Files over Dresden Files. Like, I think your like secondary characters are fantastic. His business partner is extremely unique in that he's differently abled, and his partner's grandmother, is that right?
Granny.
Is Romany.
Yeah.
Which is also very unique.
Well, I just love the idea of taking, you know, the old gypsy whatever, and of course you can't use that term anymore, right? Which is fine, but it's that whole thing, right? There's this trope, and how do you turn that around?
Right.
You know, and yes, she is Romany. She's been called gypsy her whole life, and you take your life in your hands doing that. And yes, she does read cards, and she does but she did it because as a young woman, you do what you need to do to survive. And yeah, it's a hustle right. And playing with those was so much fun.
Yeah. And she also keeps wolfsbane over her stove, like that sort of thing.
As
I
one
love
does.
it. Yeah, exactly. I love it when books do that thing where it's like, oh, you know, you're in a very modern setting, and this is why I love urban fantasy. Like, you're in a modern day kitchen, but you've got these sort of old worldy and fantastical things just kind of in the corners. Like,
and the secret, and you do this in your work, you know, where it's a perfectly normal kind of thing. I mean, guy's a janitor at a mall. He's doing his thing, right? And these weird things happen. I mean, with Johnny thinks he's the weirdest thing out there, right? And he's finding out that he's wrong. But he's also, you know, as I have said to anybody that will listen, I may have a lot of characters over the course of the books, but there will be no Fae. I have my standards.
It's funny. I'm doing an interview shortly with Thomas Keller, who writes the Vegas Fae series.
Right.
So we've already got someone doing that. We don't need
cool, because you know, you ain't gonna get that
covered.
from me.
Don't worry about it.
But the idea of the real world, it's funny. There's a guy, Jamie Davis, who I just interviewed on my blog, who does a very cool series, urban fantasy series, where this guy graduates from EMT school and gets assigned to a paramedic unit that handles these fantasy creatures.
Oh, that's cool.
You know, how much saline do you give a vampire? You know, it's the normal world except for this. And that's what's fun. I mean, some people kind of run rampant with urban fantasy, and there's all like as much as I love Dresden, and he is, you know, that book is kind of the mother lode. At some point, he just started making stuff up. Like, he was running out of characters and started inventing weird stuff. And I hopefully will not do that. I think there are limits to how much weirdness you can have in the world and still keep it hidden. But that's the constraint that I create around my story. You've got very clear constraints about what does and doesn't happen. And so we all have to do that. And if some people want to have the Fae running around Las Vegas, knock yourselves out.
As you're talking about, Dresden started off sort of these one-off things that you can read out of order.
Right.
And the further along in the series you get, the more you can't do that anymore because you'll be just completely lost. My
goal with Johnny is that people can drop in. You know, I'm intentionally modeling it after that pulp drugstore spinner rack paperback.
Yeah. And I think that's something that I'm looking forward to with this series, and I don't see enough of. A lot of people, mine too, we go in sequence. You can't just drop in. And I would like to, I'm looking forward to having a series where I can. The second book is set in Vegas.
It is.
Can I ask?
I am 38,000 words in, which means I'm halfway done if that's what you're asking me.
Yes, I am asking you that. I'm waiting. You might not have a publisher breathing down your neck, but I am.
God bless you. What actually happened is between pandemic and the day job taking off, I realized when I finally got back to it that from about the middle of December until the end of February, I had not written a word. Like literally not a word on the story. And so I've managed to get back in, and I've cranked out the last couple of weeks. I've got some momentum back. So hopefully it won't be long.
Awesome. And that'll be coming out through Black Rose again?
Yeah, I suspect so.
Okay.
Unless they know something I don't. I mean, my first publisher didn't want to do my second book, so.
Well, I don't think they'll have any problem with this.
I don't either. We seem to be working together well, and the book is doing okay, and you know, so that's all good.
You briefly mentioned a second ago that you also have an author interview series that you do on your blog.
Yeah, if you go to wayneturmel.com, and you know, because nobody really cares, I can interview whoever I want, but I kind of make a point of either, because you know, I'm shamefully shilling my own stuff. It's either historical fiction authors or urban fantasy authors, and almost entirely indie or very small press. We're all trying to support each other. We're all in the same boat. And if you like my work, you might like their work. And it's been wonderful. There are a number of authors that I have, even though I have never met them, have developed real relationships with, you know, and we communicate with each other, and we share leads, and we support each other's work, and we retweet each other, and you know, all of that good stuff, and creating a community.
That covers almost everything. I did have a
Lord, woman, we've been at it an hour. How much more is there?
I just have a couple more questions to close up, and it's mostly about.
I'm typo positive. Okay, are you happy?
How, if people want to follow you or keep up with you, how can they get more information about you or your work?
You know, the two easiest ways: Twitter @WTurmel, Turmel. I am a shameless acceptor of followers and following back unless there's compelling reason not to. And WayneTurmel.com.
And if authors want to be interviewed and appear on your blog, they can do that through your website.
Drop a brother a line. You can do it through the website. You can do it on Twitter. It's not like I'm hard to find.
And then a question I ask at the end of these interviews. If you were to encounter a writer that has recently moved to Las Vegas or is considering a move to Las Vegas, what kind of would you give them in terms of advice or guidance about that decision?
There's kind of the good advice that Uncle Wayne would give somebody if he was being a responsible adult. And there's the other part. Uncle Wayne would say, take advantage of the million writers groups. So meeting up, just pop in. It is a very, and it's the nature of Las Vegas, it's a very welcoming kind of thing. We'll let anybody through the door. Whether you choose to stay, whether we like you several weeks in is a totally different question, but bring it. So that's the responsible grown-up thing. The other thing, just as a writer, is do Las Vegas. And it's not just the casinos and stuff, although you should do that anyway, just to experience it. But if you stand at the Arrivals Lounge, the International Arrivals Lounge at McCarran Airport, and you can't come up with a story idea within an hour, go do something else. Find a dive bar and just sit in a dive bar. The black sheep of the world are running through this, and no good story starts with, I did exactly what mommy wanted.
It's very true. People watching is second to none here, for sure.
It is the best. It is the best people watching in the world. 10% of the US population comes through Las Vegas every 3 years. There are 300 and something million people in the US. Statistically, somebody will come to Vegas at least once in their life. Every story in America has a chapter here if you want it to have.
And everyone's got a Vegas story.
Well, they do if they do it right.
Yeah, if you come to Vegas and you don't have something to talk about, I don't know what happens.
There is no hope for you.
Yeah, it's pretty much.
I remember in Johnny Lycan, the nurse character says to him, if you come back from Vegas and you don't have one story that you are deeply ashamed of, you are no friend of mine.
And that's just true, I think.
That's just good life advice right there.
100%. Okay. Anything else you want to say, promote, anything that we should look out for?
Well, we got to promote your stuff because it's fabulous. And you are doing yeoman service. I mean, doing the reviews and you're really doing what I try to do in my way, although, I'm not doing YouTube and all that good stuff, is writers supporting each other and getting the word out. It's not a zero-sum game.
No, it isn't. And I think that's another misconception about the industry is it's not free to market and competition isn't really real.
On any given day. I mean, if you're my competition, that means if somebody reads my book, they're not going to read yours.
Right, which is...
And it's not like, I've read my book for the year, I'm done.
Right.
Don't do that, especially with genre fiction. And so, writing is social. I love writers. I love hanging out with their weird little brains.
Thank you so much for coming on and talking to me. I know we went way over time. So appreciate that.
Well, if anybody's still listening, God love you. Thank you for hanging in there.
Yes. And thanks everyone for watching. As always, like and subscribe to the channel, and we will see you again soon.